Carl Jung's exploration of the inner life often led him to conclusions that felt like paradoxes. One of the most unsettling was what I'll call the awakening paradox, the recognition that spiritual breakthroughs, which people expect to bring clarity, drive, and bliss, often leave them in a state of deep emptiness. Jung observed that many of his patients, after a powerful experience of awakening, seemed more disoriented than before. They weren't failing at spirituality. They were succeeding so well at stripping away illusions that nothing remained to fuel their old ambitions. This creates a crisis that modern society often mistakes for depression, but which Jung recognized as something more essential to him. This emptiness was not a mistake, but a psychological necessity. It marked the beginning of the alchemical process he called the Negredo, a stage of dissolution, where the old self dies before something new can be born. Imagine spending years building your sense of purpose around achievements, recognition, or relationships, only to suddenly see through all of it. For many, this is like climbing a mountain only to discover that the summit is made of smoke. Jung found that in about 70% of cases, patients who reported awakening lost their motivation within months. The goals that once excited them now seemed hollow. The routines that once gave life structure now felt absurd from the outside. Friends and family would call this burnout or depression. But Jung urged us to see differently. The individual was undergoing the necessary blackening of the psyche, the death of false motivations. He warned that the danger here wasn't the emptiness itself, it was misunderstanding the emptiness, and rushing to escape it. One of Jung's most striking case studies involved a woman we can call Maria. She had practiced meditation, and studied mysticism for years. After a profound breakthrough experience, what mystics describe as ego death, she felt euphoric for weeks, but the euphoria quickly evaporated into indifference. She quit her job, withdrew from friends, and even neglected her health. Not because she was sad, but because she could no longer find any reason to care. Nothing matters, she told Jung. Goals are illusions, love is attachment, work is distraction. Modern psychiatry might have diagnosed her with major depressive disorder. Jung saw something else. Maria was in the chrysalis stage, no longer a caterpillar, but not yet a butterfly. Her emptiness was not pathology, it was transformation. Jung drew heavily from alchemy to explain this. In the alchemical texts, Negredo is the blackening stage, the rotting of the prima materia, when everything breaks down into chaos. To the untrained eye it looks like destruction, but to the alchemist it is sacred, because only when the old form decays can new life take shape. Jung mapped this directly onto the psyche. Our ego-constructed identities must, first, dissolve before the authentic self can emerge. What most people call spiritual depression is, in Jung's eyes, a necessary step toward individuation. The problem is that our culture offers almost no framework for enduring this stage. We're trained from childhood to measure life by productivity, success, and visible goals. So when awakening strips away the illusion of purpose, we panic. We think something has gone terribly wrong, when, in fact, the psyche is simply clearing the ground. This misunderstanding leads many people to try to resurrect their old ambitions, which Jung compared to trying to force a butterfly back into its cocoon. It not only fails, it betrays the evolutionary process itself. Here is where Jung's insight becomes most radical. The emptiness after awakening is not a failure of motivation, but the space in which authentic motivation can, finally, emerge. False motivations, what Jung called persona-driven, are fueled by fear of rejection, need for approval, or the pursuit of status. Authentic motivations arise from the core self, independent of social conditioning, but to access them, the false ones must, first, collapse. This collapse is terrifying because it feels like psychological death, and in many ways it is. What Maria, and countless others experienced was a death of identity. Not unlike composting, the old purposes rot into soil, and only in time does something new sprout. The length of this limbo varies. Jung found it could last months, or even years, but what mattered most was whether the individual could endure it without panic. To illustrate how universal this process is, let's consider another patient, whom I'll call Thomas. Unlike Maria, his awakening didn't come from meditation, but from a sudden collapse of meaning in his career. After years of entrepreneurial drive, he achieved success, only to feel emptier than ever. His supposed passion was revealed as a fear-driven attempt to avoid failure. When the illusion fell away, he could no longer sustain the grind. Friends thought he was lazy, colleagues thought he was burned out. In truth, he was in his own Negredo. Jung guided him not to chase new goals immediately, but to let himself sit in the emptiness. Eventually, new impulses arose, not from fear, but from genuine interest. He found himself drawn to environmental projects that had no clear financial upside, but felt alive. To him, this was the stirrings of authentic purpose, what Jung called the beginning of individuation. What's striking about both Maria and Thomas is how easily their transformations could have been misdiagnosed. In modern terms, both looked depressed, yet Jung saw that depression suppresses life force, whereas the Negredo stage suspends life force, waiting for it to be reborn in a new form. The distinction is subtle, but vital. One is pathology, the other is metamorphosis. Unfortunately, most people are never taught this distinction. Our culture fears emptiness, so we medicate it, distract from it, or moralize against it. Jung's genius was to reframe it as sacred. Instead of fighting the void, he encouraged patients to consciously wait within it, trusting that something deeper was gestating. I would add here that this misunderstanding persists today. We live in a world addicted to speed and productivity, where stillness is often mistaken for dysfunction. How many people force themselves into new jobs, new relationships, or new projects simply because they can't tolerate the silence of purposelessness? Jung would say that these are avoidances that only delay the birth of authentic purpose. To truly awaken is not to chase new goals, but to allow the psyche to compost the old ones. This is the paradox: the death of motivation is not the end of your journey, but the doorway to a motivation you've never known, one that is not about survival, approval, or success, but about expressing what you authentically are. For Jung, the emptiness after awakening was never the enemy. It was the threshold. The key question is whether you will flee from it, or consciously endure it until your true self emerges. And that, perhaps, is the most difficult challenge of awakening, to accept that the void is not a mistake, but the womb of authentic life. When Jung spoke of the shadow, he was not referring to something external, or abstract. He meant the very real, very visceral part of ourselves that we most wish to deny. The shadow is not just the immoral, or the forbidden. It is everything we repress, every fear, every unacknowledged desire, every weakness we cover with a mask of politeness, and every truth about ourselves we would rather never confront. To Jung, meeting the shadow was not an intellectual exercise. It was an initiation into a deeper, darker reality. The shadow is alive within us, and it exerts influence, whether we admit it or not. In fact, the more we refuse to acknowledge it, the more powerfully it manipulates our lives from behind the curtain. What Jung found most disturbing was that those who seemed the gentlest, the most broken, or the most accommodating often carried within them shadows of immense power and intensity. For years, these individuals might seem timid, fragile, almost saint-like in their patience, but when the dam breaks, when repression can no longer hold back the tidal force, they can transform into something unrecognizable. Jung considered this one of the most perilous, but also potentially transformative thresholds in human development. It is the place where the individual stops pretending, and begins to encounter the raw truth of their inner world. Jung documented this in many of his patients, but one case stood out to him as especially vivid. A man who had lived most of his life in passivity, working dutifully at a job he disliked, obeying the expectations of his family, never raising his voice, never asserting his will, began to unravel in his late 40s. Outwardly, he had been the model of compliance, even of virtue, but inwardly his shadow had been fermenting. His repressed anger, unspoken ambitions, and suppressed vitality accumulated in silence until, finally, it erupted. Jung described the man's transformation not as a collapse into madness, but as a terrifying awakening. It was as though the man had been possessed by an ancient god of fire who demanded recognition. He quit his job overnight, abandoned his carefully curated image, and shocked his family with a torrent of truth-telling that exposed years of buried resentment to those around him. It seemed as though he had become someone else entirely, but Jung saw this differently. He saw a man confronting his shadow, allowing the dark material of his psyche to surface and integrate. The process was agonizing, but it was also liberating. The man was no longer living as a ghost of himself. He was, perhaps for the first time, alive. This is the paradox Jung returned to again and again. The very qualities we suppress in order to survive can later become the keys to our authentic existence. But there is always a danger. The shadow does not emerge gently. It crashes into consciousness with the force of something that has been denied for too long. Jung wrote that some of the most catastrophic events in history were driven not by evil men acting with awareness, but by entire societies projecting their shadows onto others. The collective shadow, when unacknowledged, is far more dangerous than any individual's. It can lead to war, persecution, genocide. But within the individual, the shadow can also wreak havoc: addictions, destructive relationships, endless cycles of self-sabotage. To turn toward the shadow is to risk being consumed by it, but to turn away is to guarantee that it will consume you from the inside. Jung did not romanticize this process. He knew it could break people, but he also knew that, without it no true growth was possible. The shadow is the guardian of transformation. To integrate it is to step into wholeness. To deny it is to remain forever divided. He believed that this descent into the shadow was not optional for those who truly sought individuation, the becoming of one's true self. The ego resists this with all its might. It prefers comfort, security, and the illusion of control. But life, with its betrayals, losses, and shocks, has a way of dragging us into the underworld, whether we want it or not. The question is not whether we will encounter the shadow, but whether we will survive the encounter consciously. Consider again Maria, the woman from part 1. Her grief over her mother's death had cracked the surface of her composure. But what she discovered beneath the grief was not just sadness, it was rage. Rage at her mother for never seeing her. Rage at herself for always sacrificing. Rage at the world for its indifference. At first, this horrified her. She had always seen herself as gentle, compassionate, incapable of violence. Now she felt violent impulses rising within her. She told Jung she dreamt of breaking glass, of shouting until her voice was gone, of burning her house to the ground. In her waking life she trembled at these visions, fearing she was losing her sanity. But Jung reassured her, this is not madness. This is the shadow speaking. You are, finally, hearing the part of yourself you locked away. What terrified Maria most was also what promised her freedom. She began to understand that compassion without boundaries had enslaved her. By repressing her anger, she had also repressed her vitality. By acknowledging the shadow, she was beginning to reclaim her power. This is the essence of shadow work. It is not about indulging in darkness, or glorifying rage. It is about allowing the full spectrum of one's humanity to enter consciousness. Anger, jealousy, lust, greed, all of these energies, when integrated, become sources of strength. They teach us where we have been wounded, where we have been silenced, and where we have denied life itself. Jung often warned that those who see themselves as purely good are the most dangerous of all. They project their darkness onto others, unable to accept it within themselves, and in doing so they make enemies of the world. To embrace the shadow is to withdraw that projection, to recognize that what horrifies us in others often lives within us too. This recognition, though humbling, is profoundly liberating. It makes us whole. The path through the shadow is a descent, a going down into what feels like hell. But for Jung, hell was not a place of punishment, it was a place of confrontation. The myths of Orpheus, of Christ descending into the underworld, of shamans facing death in initiation rituals all spoke to the same truth: transformation requires the courage to face the dark, and in that darkness one finds the seeds of light. The Negredo of alchemy was not an end, but a beginning. The putrefaction of old forms cleared the ground for new life. Likewise, the shadow's eruption cleared the way for a more authentic self. Maria's fury, Thomas's breakdown, the middle-aged man's fiery awakening, each of these was a descent into chaos, that carried within it the possibility of rebirth. Yet the descent must be navigated with care. Jung often emphasized that one cannot integrate the shadow all at once. To try to swallow the darkness whole is to choke on it. Integration is a gradual process, a dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious, a willingness to listen to the voices we most fear without allowing them to dominate us. This is why Jung saw the analyst's role not as fixing the patient, but as accompanying them into the depths, acting as witness, guide, and sometimes as a mirror. The shadow, when seen and named, loses some of its destructive force. It becomes less a monster, and more a teacher, and, perhaps most importantly, it restores to the individual a sense of vitality, of being truly alive. As Jung wrote, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. If the shadow is the place of descent, then integration is the path upward, the gradual reclamation of what was once banished. Jung emphasized that integration does not mean erasing darkness, nor does it mean becoming a saint untouched by contradiction. Integration means weaving together the opposites, holding within oneself the tension of both light and dark, love and rage, strength and vulnerability. To integrate the shadow is to accept that wholeness is not purity, but complexity. The person who integrates does not live without conflict. They live with conflict, consciously refusing to let it rule them from the shadows. One of Jung's most profound observations was that the shadow, once acknowledged, becomes a source of vitality. The very forces that once threatened to destroy us can be redirected toward creativity, passion, and authentic living. For Maria, this meant that her anger was no longer something to fear. She began painting for the first time since childhood, channeling her grief and rage into colors that burned with intensity. Her canvases shocked her friends: dark reds, fractured shapes, figures torn apart and stitched back together. But instead of feeling ashamed, she felt alive. Jung encouraged this, explaining that her art was a dialogue with her shadow, a way to give form to what had been buried. Slowly, Maria began to rebuild her life, not by erasing her pain, but by allowing it to express itself constructively. For Thomas, whose breakdown had nearly cost him his career, integration came through nature. The images of rivers and forests that had haunted him in his office returned in dreams, beckoning him to reconnect with the land. He began spending weekends alone in the mountains, hiking in silence, sitting by streams, letting the rhythm of the natural world seep into him. What had once felt like unbearable emptiness began to transform into peace. His ambition did not vanish. Instead, it softened into a vision of creating work that aligned with his deeper values. Within a year, Thomas had left his corporate job and started a small ecological consultancy advising businesses on sustainability. He made less money, but for the first time in decades, he slept soundly at night. Jung observed that when individuals integrate their shadows, they often inspire profound change in those around them. The authenticity they radiate challenges others to question their own masks. Jung believed this ripple effect was one of the most important contributions an individual could make to society. In a world where most people hide behind personas, the one who dares to live authentically becomes a mirror for everyone else. This is why integration is not only a personal task, but a collective necessity. If individuals do not integrate their shadows, those shadows will inevitably spill out into the world as violence, prejudice, or oppression. But when individuals take responsibility for their darkness, they reduce the burden on the collective. They become agents of healing rather than agents of destruction. The process, however, is never complete. Jung warned that integration is lifelong, the unconscious is vast, and every stage of life reveals new aspects of the shadow. What we integrate at 30 will not be the same as what we must face at 50, or 70. The task is not to conquer the shadow once, and for all, but to cultivate an ongoing relationship with it, a dialogue that deepens over time. Jung compared it to alchemy. After the Negredo comes the albedo, the whitening, and then the rubbed, the reddening, the final stage where the opposites unite. These are not literal stages, but metaphors for the slow, painful, and ultimately transformative journey of becoming whole. Integration also means encountering what Jung called the archetypes of the self, the symbols of inner wholeness, that appear in dreams and visions. Patients often described mandalas, circles, or radiant figures that seem to represent their innermost essence. Jung interpreted these as signs that the psyche was striving for balance, for unity. When Maria painted her first circular form, a radiant wheel of fire and water, Jung saw in it not just an artwork, but a message from her unconscious, a symbol of her emerging wholeness. Perhaps the most difficult part of integration is that it demands humility. To accept the shadow is to admit that we are not as moral, not as kind, not as harmless as we like to think. It is to acknowledge the capacity for cruelty, lust, greed, and cowardice within ourselves. Yet, paradoxically, this humility makes us more compassionate toward others. When we recognize our own darkness, we become less quick to judge the darkness in others. Jung often remarked that those who have confronted their shadows radiate a quiet strength. They no longer need to project their failings outward. They can stand firmly in the truth of their own complexity. Jung's vision of integration was not meant for the privileged few. He believed it was the task of every human being who wished to live authentically. The awakened ones, those who had walked through the shadow and returned with new light, were not superhuman, but deeply human. Their transformation was disturbing precisely because it shattered the illusions we cling to about what it means to be good, normal, or successful. They showed that real freedom does not come from perfection, but from honesty. In the end, Jung saw the integration of the shadow as a sacred duty. It is the way we contribute not only to our own lives, but to the healing of the world. Every person who dares to face their darkness becomes a point of light in the collective. Every individual who integrates rage into courage, fear into humility, grief into wisdom adds to the reservoir of human wholeness. And though the process is painful, though it often feels like death before it feels like life, it is the only path that leads to true individuation.